and welcome back to the Beer Ladies podcast. I am Katie, today's host. Woo, hello. And in this episode, we are talking about brown ales. And what is a brown ale? I see some of my co-hosts here holding up their brown ales. Today, we are joined by Carolyn, all the way in Texas, Lisa, and Thandi. Before I go to what we're drinking, I am going to do a shout out to all of our social media. So our tag is now at Beer Ladies Pod on both Twitter and Instagram. We're also on Facebook. We are wherever you get your podcasts, and we're also on YouTubes. Oh, I'm such a boomer. My kids will go, Mom.
On the YouTubes. Yeah.
On the YouTubes, you know. We're on the YouTubes. We have our own vanity headline / Beer Ladies podcast. So check us out, like, share, subscribe, give us your opinions, because I am definitely not an expert on all things brown ale. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on it. I'm going to go around and I'm going to say, what are we drinking? So Carolyn, who had to get up at 10 a.m. this morning to go and buy her beer in Texas. Tell us what you're drinking.
Such struggle. I'm drinking AleSmith Brewing Company's Nutty Brown Ale. Said it's a tribute to our favorite English style. Deep mahogany color, rich notes of biscuit, cocoa, and creamy mouthful, full body. So we'll see.
Very nice. And it's called nut brown, right? But
yeah,
are there nuts in it?
I don't know.
Probably not. That's a question we might answer.
Yeah.
Next, we'll go to Lisa. What are you drinking?
Perfect question, because I have the Lochgill Macadamia Nut Brown Ale. So yes, technically there are nuts in it, I suppose, somewhere in the boil. It's one of those things. I love a brown ale. I love macadamia nuts. I've never necessarily noticed any kind of macadamia flavor per se in it, but I'm like, you know what? You had me with putting those words together. So always good. It's just a really, really good go-to. Love a good brown ale. So always happy to have that.
Very nice. I've had that. I really like that one as well, Lisa. So Thandi, what are you drinking?
Well, now I've got a little bit of FOMO because I still haven't had that nut brown ale, and I'm very upset with myself because I really do love a nut brown. But I've got a Crafty Brewing Company American style brown ale. There's the image on the YouTubes for all the boomers and millennials and everybody else in between. So this is one that I drink often, actually, because I love it, and it's very close to me. My nearest Lidl is 500 meters away, and it's just very convenient for me to get these beers. Good price range, good, well brewed, all of the things. Although I was quite upset because I did have a Kennegar brown ale that impulsively I drank before this episode, and I really should have kept it, but I didn't. So there we are.
You can still tell us what you thought.
Oh, I thought it was lovely, actually. I mean, it's funny because when I tasted that Kennegar one, I was like, oh, this is definitely a Kennegar beer. And it's weird because I think that sometimes you can tell a brewery by their house yeast in a way.
Yep,
and there is something about Kennegar, and I actually think it's their rye. I think I can tell their beers because of rye, and I'm sure that there was rye in that beer or something. But you could have blindfolded me and I would have known it was from Kennegar. So
wow,
there it is.
I wonder about that because I thought that one was especially dry, and that kind of mouthfeel I find very characteristic of a lot of their beers. So maybe there's something in that.
Something in that, yeah. So I enjoyed that one. I'm enjoying this one thoroughly. Next I need to get the rest.
Well, I kind of copied your homework there, Thandi, by getting
good taste.
The same American style brown ale. It actually won the World Beer Award for Ireland brown ales, but I had done backup homework. So I also have a Belgian. It's a Le Trappiste. It's a double. Now, is it technically brown? We'll discuss it, but it's kind of brown in my glass. Is that a brown ale?
Brown
that is
color.
the question. That is the question. Okay. So let's move on. So we're talking about all things brown ale, and there is I think, was it Brian from Brewing? Crack Beer Society?
Crack Beer Community, yes.
Community, that's what they're called. Put a shout out that he wants to have a resurgence of the brown ale, and I think we echo his sentiments completely. So
Absolutely.
So what is a brown ale, and why do we love it so much?
And that's the thing, it's so hard to define in some ways, because you could say, is it any beer that's brown? Maybe,
Exactly.
but not
So
necessarily.
Is this a brown ale?
Right? I would say no to that one. But then again, like, is an oud Brewing also, it's brown, but to me, they're very different things. So when once you start putting labels on them, and we'll talk a little bit more about it when we get to the history section. But I think, Thandi, you look like you have homebrew opinions. So,
I kind of do. So I mean, largely the kinds of brown ales are not really defined by just the color brown, because you can even have an IPA that's brown, and it just depends on your malt characteristics and how you've brewed it and all the different things. But largely brown ales can almost be split into maybe 3 or 4 categories, primarily almost 3. The fourth, I think we can debate. The first one is English brown ales, and that can include anything from a dark mild all the way through to a porter. But there is specifically some styles like a London brown ale or just a brown ale that are the most sort of characteristic of the style, where we're talking about a malt forward beer, something that's got a bit of chocolate in the taste, something that's got a bit of toffee or caramel, not super bitter, not super hoppy, and typically brewed with brown malts and chocolate malts. So that's the one kind of big family. The other one is, and I feel like we'll be beating this drum whenever it comes to style guides, but the American brown ales, right? So American brown ales take what the English did or the British did and just made it bigger and hoppier. So that was the same with IPAs. It was the same with red ales. It's going to be the same with everything. So, now we're typically talking about a slightly different balance between bitterness and the malty kind of toffee chocolatiness of a brown ale. We want a slightly more balanced beer, a little bit more bitterness, but not also known for its hoppy characteristic, but it has got a bumped, like a higher bitterness. Then we've got Belden Brown. So there really is the oud brew, and that's the one that's the best known. So it's a brown ale, but it's sour. It's got a lactic sourness. And Katie, I remember you mentioned I think it was our sours episode, was it? But
It
no,
was
it wasn't there.
It was the red ale episode, the Flanders Red.
That was it. And you hadn't quite read the bottle, so you were surprised that it was, let's say, a sour version of something that you thought you knew. And the oud Brewing is the same thing. So it's a brown ale, but it's got that sort of sour tang to it, which gives it a distinctive edge. And then we've got German brown ales, except that they're not always ales, they're mostly lagers. And the difference between ales and lagers would be the different kind of yeast that you use. So ales are fermented at slightly warmer temperatures, and they're using top fermenting yeast, that's the one, and lagers are colder temperatures and they use bottom fermenting yeast. God, Lisa, help me out if I'm wrong. But, but there's a few.
So would like a Dunkel be a brown ale or a Weiss beer? Or is it the intersection of a brown ale and a Weiss beer?
I don't know.
Interesting.
Neither, but it's an interesting question. Yeah.
Because, okay, you get Dunkel Weiss, all right?
Yeah,
so Dunkel is a dark wheat beer, but that's not necessarily the same as a Dunkel. A Dunkel is just a dark beer, and it could be maltier, or it could be, it could have a lot of the shared characteristics. But I'd almost argue that it's probably not the same, because it's not really known for its chocolatiness as much as other brown beers or brown ales are. But Lisa, I'm so open to being corrected, and anybody else, let me know.
Well, I wonder that, because it is tricky, because then you can start to get into, I feel like then you get into that weird thing between a Dunkel and a Schwarzbier, where there can be a continuum, but they are technically different things. But again, I feel like in my mind, and this is not always, this is more based on sort of my own personal sensory experience than the correct, if you like, thing. I feel like a Dunkel they both have that kind of lovely brown color, but I feel like the Dunkel tends to be, isn't always, a little bit sweeter, a little bit more sort of that bread or crackery kind of characteristic, whereas the Schwarzbier has a little bit more almost, I would say almost burnt toast kind of a flavor to it, but again, more lagery, if you like, even though again both on the continuum, but at the same time, the Venn diagram is kind of they're definitely overlapping in certain areas. And there are certainly some that I think that actually are, Dunkels that get categorized as Schwarzbiers, and Schwarzbiers that get categorized as Dunkels. In theory, the Schwarzbier would also be a little bit darker, probably have some patent malts, but these things are fuzzy. But I think where it gets really complicated, and we won't dive into it yet, but in a little bit, is when we look at kind of the history of what is a brown ale, because sometimes we just call anything that's brown a brown ale, and then it gets really problematic. So
Yeah, exactly. And something like an alt, which is a German hybrid beer, it's a hybrid between an ale and a lager, is let's say loosely categorized into German brown beers, but it doesn't have to be super brown. It can be anywhere on the amber to brown spectrum. So I think there's a lot of room for interpretation here. But in my mind, and again, Lisa, it's probably not the official definition, but in my mind, a brown ale has got to have some kind of chocolatiness to it, but in a way that a stout has roastiness to accompany it. I think a brown ale's got a bit of a breadiness or something, or maybe a caramel to offset it.
Yeah, and I think you're on the right track there. With it's easier to say how it's different from a stout or a porter than it is how it is similar to other things, because it can be similar to so many other things. And I think again, kind of a lot of the rules, if you like, don't necessarily they're not exactly enforced, if you like, which is okay.
Because I'm looking at the some of the brown the style guidelines. So they include the English style brown, the brown porter. So is a brown porter a porter or a brown ale? It's a brown porter. Belgian style brown, which is the Oud brew, I'm presuming. German style brown ale and American style brown ale.
Yeah.
So
and they'll probably only be different in a certain number of things. So obviously Belgian, slightly sour. German will probably be a lager, or at least a hybrid. So there'll be slightly more of a breadiness or a crackery-ness, as Lisa said, a different finish. Often ales have a slightly almost fruitier finish than a lager does. Lagers have a bready, clean sort of finish. But brown ale should tend to be a little bit dry, mostly malty, mostly sweet, not overly so. And because of the spectrum of the different styles under them, it can be like a porter, or it can be like a dark mild in terms of alcohol as well. So we might be looking at anything from a 3% up until like a 7%, probably in some of the American ones. Very big style again.
Yeah. I totally agree. And just like two of my favorites that you can get in America are absolutely at those extremes. There's one at Burke-Gilman Brewing Company in Seattle, which they call London Brown. It's about a 3%. What I'm going to call, although I'm going to circle back to this, a sort of Southern style English brown ale. But again, put a pin in that because we're going to come back to it. And then Dogfish Head's Indian Brown, which is, very hoppy, about 7%. But, they're both, you can taste both and say, yes, these are in the same category. They're just different extremes, if you like. And then, of course, I'm sure there are, a dozen imperial browns out there that, have probably morphed into being something else. But again, they're both great beers. And I think we're all going to talk about how we really love brown ales and want to see more of them. And I think, there is that room for expression. And maybe that's a reason people can kind of latch onto them.
Yeah.
I guess
there is.
On the back of this, it says pairs well with aged Gouda. So I'm curious, what else would you pair with a brown ale?
In my research, my lengthy research for this episode, it goes with a lot of food. Like it can go with a curry, it can go with like any type of like Thai, Indian.
Yeah, this says hearty foods like roast pork, smoked sausage, grilled salmon, which I think salmon's an interesting choice, but
interesting. Or steak or something. Yeah, it does stand up well.
It says like an almond or maple walnut cake, like cashew brittle. So like I guess pear fritters, which I think that would be interesting to have a pear fritter with a brown ale.
That does sound interesting. One of the articles that I read talked about sushi being paired even with brown ale. And I thought that's a really strange combination. But it wasn't so much that it paired well, it's that it was one of the better pairings as opposed to a number of other styles.
Got it.
So it was, let's call it a safe default, which makes me think it's one of those that you could kind of have with anything. Although I think it would go really well with like a braai or a barbecue. Have some sticky ribs with a brown ale. For me, that just feels like the right thing.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It is really versatile because I think, the first thing I ever brewed as a home brewer was when I'm putting air quotes on this, nut brown ale. And again, put a pin in that. We're going to come back to some of this, but I think it's a nice kind of entry level thing to do as a home brewer because you can get a lot of the stuff either as a kit or extract, all of that stuff. You don't have to do all of the things as you might do as you get a little bit more sophisticated. But I think because you're not trying to get a really specific kind of color necessarily, or necessarily even a really specific gravity, it's again not necessarily easy to get right, but it's one that's the degree of difficulty is not as high if you're making it as a home brewer, because so many things can qualify. But I think that the
Very
nice
forgiving.
thing about it, very forgiving, that's exactly how to say it. But I think
And I think
exactly
that leads me to wonder why more smaller breweries don't brew it more often.
Right. You're here.
Yeah.
I've got a feeling it's because people think that they're boring.
Really?
Yeah. You know how these things go in and out of fashion, right? And even and I'm sure Lisa will talk to more of this in the history section, but even the rise of brown ale's popularity was somewhat diametrically linked, supposedly, to the popularity of hoppier pale ales. So if you think about it, they're almost the exact opposite of something like an IPA, which is very hoppy, probably quite pale, maybe quite carbonated, like very heavy. There's a number of different ways that an IPA might be. This is kind of the opposite. It's sweeter. It's a little bit. I don't want to say less complex, because I think there's a lot of complexity in these malt forward beers that people don't always give credit to. But it's not the kind of complexity that people have been endeared to in the last many years. It was always this hoppy stuff, and now it's sour stuff, and then it was various milkshakey, lactosey things, and brown ale's just been in the background the whole time, like, hey dudes, I'm a solid beer. What the heck, man? Like, yeah.
And I think that's it. I go for a brown ale, and again, I go for them a lot because I love them. I think because it absolutely, first of all, it tastes like beer, which I think not necessarily is true of some of the other weirder things, but you get real flavor. Even if it's pretty low key, you get a little bit of complexity. And that, it doesn't mean it has to be aggressive or it has to be so complex that you're like, oh, this is this or that. But it's I think we're really lucky here in Ireland because we have the Ballycliffe Brown, which is just probably my favorite go-to beer. We have the Lochgill one, which again, they're available year round. But I wrote a big piece on this. Big piece. I wrote a blog post about this. It wasn't that in depth, but thinking about how when you go to Hawaii, brown ales and porters are a huge thing. It's just a big part of the scene there. And it's a whole thing. So for example, Maui Brewing has Town Brown as one of their standard year-round beers. They do the coconut Hiwa porter. Waikiki Brewing does what they call an English brown ale. It's just a very, very common thing there. And it really, I think, sort of puts in sort of sharp contrast. People be like, oh, I wouldn't like it if it's hot or something. No, it is fantastic if it's hot. And I think that's the other thing. It's really an all-round year-round beer. It doesn't have to be cold. It doesn't have to be hot. But I would love to do kind of a historical deep dive on why Hawaii specifically has ended up as kind of a brown and dark beer paradise, if you like, literally. But again, I think it's really interesting. You have places around the world where they've really just kind of stuck in and become, the go-to.
Carolyn, do you find more options for brown ales and even nut brown ales, in Texas? I feel like in Ireland, we maybe have 2 or 3 year round that we can find, but they're not super common. What do you feel in the US market?
Well, I don't want to drink a lot of brown ale. So going to the store this morning, I was like, what do we have? And he's like, oh, we have this. Like they had like 5 different cans. So I guess it just depends on who it is. I mean, again, like IPA, I feel like is king, which is not my favorite, as people who listen to this know. But I don't know. I mean, it could be up and coming and I just don't know. But based on what I saw at the store, like they had enough to satisfy somebody's need for it. They really wanted it. They had it. They have it.
And you weren't stuck with the same one. You had choice and variety.
Yeah, I had like 5 choices of single cans. I'm sure there was more in like 6 packs, but for what I was looking for. And I like went back
What?
and was like, I think I want the other one. And then I was like, no, I want this one. So I was debating on which one to pick.
So tell me you got both.
No, I only got one. I'll go back and get the other one later because I have to
Good.
go get pumpkin beer. So
Yeah, fair.
Fair.
Would you guys be partial to a brown ale that was a nut brown ale or a non-nut brown ale, and why?
Well, I think to answer this question, we need to know the difference. And I think Lisa has input in this.
Well, so I think I will have to give everyone, and we're going to have a link to this in the show notes, but Martin Cornell has a fantastic article on his website, why there's no such thing as English brown ale. So just putting it right out there. He's like, it's not real, it's fake, here's why. And it's a fascinating read, and I always love reading his stuff. For those not in the know, he is a fantastic beer historian. He really, gets in there and gets the good stuff. But he looks a bit at, Newcastle Brown, which he calls sort of the type Northern Brown Ale, but then explains why that's not true. And he looks at Mann's Brown Ale, the type Southern Brown Ale, and says also not true. But his specific issue with nut brown is that, the nut in theory is not about a flavor, but is about the color. But then he goes on to say, but hazelnuts are one color, chestnuts are another color. They're not useful to describe beer. What are you doing, people? And it's a fascinating read. But then, again, on the flip side, I've got the McNutty. There's nuts in this, and I've had the Rogue Morimoto hazelnut stout. There are hazelnuts, is at least, again, somewhere in the recipe. Whether you can taste them or not is another question. I've had a chestnut beer before as well that was also a brown ale. So does it exist now? I think maybe is a question. I think his argument is pretty convincing that nut brown ale, and kind of what he was saying is that it's saying it's lighter than lager. But again, if you're sort of looking historically, a lot of things are brown until you get real black patent malts, which you don't get until about 1817, 1820, thereabouts. And then suddenly your porters and your stouts are all like, look, we're black, we're not brown, we're fancy now. And everything else kind of becomes brown until kind of lager and pale ale takes off. And then brown ales are kind of left in the middle somewhere. But again, he makes a really convincing argument that a lot of this is kind of very quiet until the 1920s when Newcastle Brown appears, and then when Mann's kind of comes. But again, Newcastle Brown in the 1920s is a very different beast from the Newcastle Brown you get nowadays for a lot of different reasons. And again, it's a long article, so I'm not going to kind of try to summarize all of it, but he makes a lot of interesting arguments over, how the strength equates to what this beer is, maybe more so than the color. But his take is basically the nut brown is purely a descriptor that, marketing people put on in kind of the 19-teens, and that everyone who now is like, oh no, I taste a nuttiness, that they're all being kind of led astray by the marketing, putting it there in their heads. Although again, open question, I think for some of these modern ones that are brewed with nuts, do you get any of the nut flavor, or is it purely kind of something that's a fermentable sugar? I don't know.
I mean, I'm drinking a nut brown right now, so I mean, I don't.
Do you
check
feel
on
it's
the-
nutty?
Yeah, do you taste it, and does it say that it has nuts on the side? Like, does it have a nut allergy warning?
It just no.
Huh. So it's
Okay.
kind of like a
Well-
pumpkin ale where there's no pumpkin sometimes.
Right.
No, it just says like toasty and cocoa and biscuit notes.
Yeah.
So there's no, I guess because it's a deep mahogany color. But yeah, I mean, I have to agree, like not all nuts are this color. I mean, not
And
all
it's
nuts are this
interesting.
deep, even if they are brown, they're not this deep mahogany.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
like a lighter brown.
And nuts taste so different, all different nuts as well.
Right.
So can you even call a flavor nutty? Like
Yeah,
I would say nutty is
Yeah.
something that you eat and is crunchy.
Yeah, I mean, this definitely is. Yeah, I don't taste any nuts. So
It's interesting because when you try and brew a nut brown ale in the most pure sense and adding nuts to your beer, like there are so many challenges to adding nuts to beer that it's almost not worth it unless you were going to buy an extract and just cheat. Because the one thing is that you generally want to roast the nuts to get most of the sugars and most of the flavors and all of the oils and stuff out. But adding the nuts into your beer adds so much oil, because as we all
That's
know,
my question.
nuts are so oily. That's why we have tahina and tahini and peanut butter and almond butter and all of these other things. Nuts are basically oils in a solid form. So when you add an oil to a beer, you have absolutely no carbonation and head retention. So I think that most people who say nut brown ale, they're either adding an extract, which is fine. It's a a perfectly fine and reasonable ingredient to a beer, or they're playing on the fact that the malts make you think or reminisce of nuts. So it's not always an ingredient. And similar to pumpkin beers, it's more about pumpkin spice mostly. It's not so much about the actual ingredient. Which
Yeah, absolutely.
all know
Although I think
to this podcast.
to circle back to the point about why aren't there so many of them, just a couple of interesting stats that Martin Cornell found was that in 1959, bottled brown ales were 12% of the total UK beer market. Like, I mean, just think about that. Like, that's crazy. But then by 1976, it was 4%. So just huge, sort of decline. Although,
and I'm wondering if an Irish brewer had anything to do with that decline.
It's an interesting question. Yeah. I mean, you really have to wonder. Yeah, does Guinness sort of muscle in and say, no, we're your dark beer now?
Yeah. I would imagine.
But on the flip side of that, then Pete's Wicked Ale takes off in the US. Probably starting in, I guess, in the 1980s, which is meant to be essentially a clone of Samuel Smith's Nut Brown-ish. And I really enjoyed Pete's Wicked Ale back in the day, and then it went away. But I do think it is really interesting that a lot of those kind of early both homebrew recipes and then microbrews in America were kind of on the darker spectrum, tended to be in air quotes English. So you would have brown ales, you would have bitters. We will have a whole discussion, I think, at some point on why we can't get more bitters here in Ireland, because please make more bitters too. I'm very happy we have some brown ales, but would love more ESBs as well, guys. So just going to put that out there into the universe. I'm going to manifest them.
And I suppose we should say a shout out to, it's Loch Gill, isn't it? That did
it is also Loch Gill.
5
exactly.
candles. It should have really have been 4 candles, so we could have had loads of puns. But I know it was a birthday. It was a birthday brew, right? Oh my God. And if you haven't, if you are too young, ask your parents about the 4 Candles comedy sketch. Have you seen it? Thandi's looking at me, and so is Carolyn.
Maybe we should link this. Must be a very specific Irish inside joke.
No, it's British. It's British. Oh. Yeah. It's just a pun.
No idea.
I'll tell you what, I will dig out a link for the YouTube. It's a little, I can't even remember. Is it the 2 Ronnies or?
It might have been. Yeah, it's something of that. I was like, is it Morecambe and Wise or the 2 Ronnies? It's that.
I can't remember. It's that ilk.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's
exactly.
My father-in-law loves 4 Candles. Yeah.
I wonder though too if one of the reasons we don't see more brown ales is because everything is still so kind of, maybe this is the wrong way to put it, sort of tarred with the Newcastle Brown brush. If people are just like, oh, that's a beer I drank when I was underage, or whatever the association is that why?
Yeah. So I suppose I would have drank. I lived in Newcastle for 2 summers of my life when I was in college. I worked in Great Northeastern Railways in Newcastle upon Tyne in their fulfillment department.
For a bit.
And we used to go around the corner and have Newcastle Brown Ale because that's what you did. But it was strong. It was rocket fuel kind of,
And it used to be stronger than it is now. That's the thing. Yeah.
But then I would not have had very much interaction with brown ales until very recently, I think. But I did notice that when I went to like brew pubs in the US, you would have a nut brown ale or a hazelnut brown ale or something like that on tap.
Yeah, or a hoppy, like a specifically hoppy brown ale, where they'll call it out and be like, it's brown, but it's hoppy. Like there's a whole thing.
But I would never have encountered that, I suppose, in Ireland.
And in South Africa, they weren't common, within the commercial beers anyway. We used to get some of the British commercial beers around. But even in Newcastle, you might have found a Newcastle, but not commonly. And so it was just never a thing, you know. In South Africa, it was lagers, many varieties,
Right.
and then there was a milk stout, which is still is very popular. And it's actually a great beer, but you know, it started changing obviously with the rise of craft beers. And one of the I almost want to say one of the first beers that I had from a different craft brewery there was a brown ale, and I was like, oh, what is this?
Yeah.
Like I'd never tried it, and it did actually have nuts in it. And they told me, the bros told me at the time how they managed to do that, as if I knew anything about brewing at the time. And I was like, fascinating. I love it. Can I just have more, please? but there's I think there's been a few since, and I don't know. I just think it's one of those styles. It's kind of like a dark mild, where it's just not. It's like not sexy, you know.
Yeah, but especially it gets the issue where on Untapped, people will give them low ratings for no particular reason. They just, you know, because they're not extreme, or because they're not necessarily, some are, but because they're not necessarily, you know, 8.5% or 9%, people are like,
Or their
Eh.
IBU isn't off the scale, you know?
right,
Yeah,
exactly. And again, I'm very happy with my own Untapped, where I can go back and see what I liked. But I called this out in a blog post I did last year about brown ales, where I was like, I love Victory Brewing Company D-Town Brown Ale. So they're in Downingtown, Pennsylvania. That's where the original brewery is. And you don't see it as much now. It was one that they only ever really did in the brew pub. But again, it would get, you know, a meh rating on Untapped. You're like, this is a great beer. Like, there's no reason this should be rated as a kind of, oh, I tried it, but it didn't, you know, it didn't wow me. It's like, but it should have. Like, it's really good beer. But I think the other one that I called out too, that I think that at least we can typically get here in Ireland, is the Colonel Brown Ale. So the Colonel has fantastic
yes.
brown ale, and I think it's 5.6%, just phenomenally good. When I see it at any of the local off licenses, I'm like, oh, yep, come home with me. So
I will have to keep an eye out. I've seen Colonel, but I think I've only seen the pale ale and the IPA in my local.
or
So
their
I might
export, their export stout too, and export porter, both gorgeous. So I love what they're doing. I've you know gotten some of their stuff when I was in London years ago, because pandemic, but always really good beer. And I love that they are doing things that are a little kind of, you know, still like a solid, you know, normal air quotes style, but ones that people aren't necessarily doing as much of. So
That is very interesting.
yeah, I'm curious though, Carolyn, like you know, you said you had sort of 5 or so to choose from. Were there any that were kind of bleeding into other styles when you were looking? I feel like that's a very American thing to do.
It was a very quick look.
Yeah.
The other one I was thinking was Cigar City, but they called out they had coffee in it. So I
Oh.
steered clear of that
Yeah.
one.
That's a pet peeve of mine too. I'm annoyed when I see that. Yeah.
Well, I just don't like coffee. So I was like,
I
yeah,
don't
I'm not going
either.
to get this one. So I'm not. So that's why I picked this one, because I was like, that one has coffee in it. This one I will probably like. I mean, I didn't really drink brown ale. So this is probably like my first brown ale in a long time. So, or
Are you
ever.
enjoying it
I don't
though?
know. Yeah, it's good. I'm just more of a wheat sour person. So this is just different.
And
to
I'm
me.
going to say I love beer with coffee in it. So
Yeah.
I would love a brown ale with coffee. See, you
I
can't
also
please
do.
all of the people all of the
No.
time.
Yeah.
you
No.
know?
It does mean though, if we get any like beer advent calendar boxes, which I've not done yet, but those of us who get coffee and don't like it, we can trade.
Yes.
Yeah.
Tradesies.
So
I don't like sours, so I'll trade all the sours.
there we
See,
go.
there you go.
See. All
This is
good.
what you have to do. You need a community to work out your advent calendar for the styles that you're not really into, you know?
That's
Yeah.
what happens though, because I like all the beer, all of it.
Then you can keep it all. Then you're grand. Yeah.
Except for maybe Rauch beers, like the smoky beers. It's ice.
Yeah,
I could
have
do
too.
like half a beer and then I'm done with that.
I have that too. Yeah, some are just a little bit too on the kind of liquid smoke end of the spectrum, and it's not for me. Yeah.
Yeah.
I completely agree. But I don't know, I feel like, again, just to go back, like there are, you know, you see so many interesting brown ales as like a one-off, and how
Yeah.
can we convince people to
Yeah.
say, we love this, please make more? And, you know, I think, again, how can we put it out there into the universe and say, hey, we'll buy them? You know, you have an
Yeah, I
audience.
feel like when I go to a brewery, I very rarely see a brown beer.
Yeah,
like, it's
and that could
Really?
change.
Or at least not one that's called a brown ale.
Yeah.
because
yeah.
That's
because that for
true.
me is the big thing, is that you actually do get a lot of brown colored beers, but they're not brown ales.
Yeah.
There is
Like-
that.
A dark amber would be very brown adjacent, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
They might call it an amber. Is amber sexier than brown?
That's
It
a really
is.
good question.
Yeah.
Ooh. It's like, so
Well, but like, what about a pub ale? A pub ale's brown,
It's a pub ale.
isn't it?
what's a pub ale?
We're
I-
learning things.
We need to know
I've
more
had-
now. Yeah.
I've had a pub ale before. Hold on. Let me Google this real quick. Stand by.
Google to the rescue.
Because a pub ale is brown.
That feels like an Americanism. Like if I've
Maybe
ever
it
heard
is
one,
an
that's it.
Americanism. It probably is an Americanism. Yeah, because it's brown. Sorry, I'm trying to find what is a pub ale real quick. Golden color, creamy head, smooth body, and easy drinking character. Medium body pale ale. So it's a medium body pale ale, but it's
Sounds like a blonde.
more. No, but it's dark. It's more like a true nut color, light color brown beer.
Okay. It all counts. It all counts.
I mean,
Cashew
I don't
nut
know.
beer.
Is copper
It's a
brown? Like
cashew.
it's,
Yeah, it's like copper brown. So I don't know.
I've never heard of a pub beer. You're teaching me things, Carolyn.
Yeah,
Then maybe it's just a American thing. I don't know.
How drunk were you when you had this pub ale, Carolyn?
I
What
drink
time
it
of
all
the
the
day?
time.
Oh, okay.
The fact that it exists on the Google is comforting to me.
right.
I mean, yeah, there are pub ales. I'm looking it up now. There's a standard English pub ale. I mean, I don't know. Maybe we'll have to do a series on pub ales.
And do they exist? And if not, do we just sort of bring them into being? Like it's a
Yeah.
whole.
Were they a thing or were they not a thing?
Yeah.
Did the Americans create it?
What- and
Americans
that's the
created
thing,
so many things,
yeah.
Carolyn. You can't have everything.
I didn't say we could. Most of the beers I like are not American style beers, so there you go.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Although I
again,
must say, one of the first times I tasted an American brown ale, and it was like quite hoppy, quite bitter, but it had that sort of weird chocolatey, toffee, caramelly balance. I was like, shit, man, this is actually delicious. Like this is the one time that I'll forgive the kind of extremism that can go into these like beer styles. But it was really good. Gosh, I'd love to taste more of them. This crafty beer one says it's an American style, but I think it's only slightly more bitter than an English style. It's not slightly more. I'd love to see it pushed a little bit again. Bring some.
and it is a
some
really
American
good
styles
beer.
in.
Again, fair play for all the awards, which I think is something we may chat about on
It's
a
lovely.
future podcast. Putting that out there for
Or we might have chatted about it in a past
we might have
podcast.
chatted about it. Yes, you're right. It depends when this comes out.
Exactly.
Yes, so, exactly. Yes. But it will be somewhere in the universe. So, but yeah, it's such an interesting thing. And because to me, I feel like now American brown specifically means hoppy brown, but is that just my take on it? I don't know.
I think that's America's take on it.
It is America's take on it, and it's the BJCP's take on it.
Because
So-
let's be real, America likes hops.
They do.
Strong
And
and
ABV. And ABV. Like
Yeah,
and
you can't
ABV.
get away from a 4.8% beer in America. It's got to be like 17.12.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do you go out and have like 4 or 5 pints if they're 17%?
Unless you train for it, you're kind of a hot mess.
You have one 17% beer and then you take a break and then you have like a 4%.
But do they even how easy is it to get 4%? Would that would be
I'd
like an
lied.
extreme session?
Well, you can get 4 or 5. I would say
Yeah.
5%. Then you
Yeah. Although that's definitely like, again, session beer by American standards is kind of under 4-ish%.
4 to 6.
Yeah. But a lot of them, like 6 is almost always your entry point for a lot of things, which is either great or terrible depending on what your goals are for your evening.
Yeah. Well, I was in Lisbon recently, and
Yes.
yeah, obviously it was took a week off work with me and my husband, and there were so many people in suits out for lunch having their beers, and I'm like,
Oh,
see, this is the way it should, because it was still
Yeah.
sunny and warm. You could sit outside, not have to worry about COVID attacking you from all angles, you know.
oh gosh.
And you could see them having their beer, then they'd have with their food, and then they'd have their coffee, and then they'd all toddle off back to their office. And I was like, this is such a great culture, and you can't do that with a big fancy high ABV
No,
beer, can you?
no.
Well, you can
definitely
try.
not.
No.
Maybe on a Friday, but yeah, no.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
all the
no.
people working from home are going, Katie, just put it in a coffee mug and no one will know the difference.
Nearly 2 years of working from home, and I've still not done that.
I haven't done that
Why?
either.
Thought
We
about
should-
it, but no.
Yeah, I thought about it, but yeah, no.
I've had strong thoughts. I've recently started a new job, so now I'm full time. My last job, I worked part-time hours. I was finished at 2:00 in the day, so now I'm working till 5 on a Friday, and I'm like, what am I going
What
to
is
do?
it? What are you?
Terrible, isn't it?
Sorry, what was that, Carolyn?
You were like, what do I do now? Like what? Like I have no time.
I'm gonna have no time, exactly. So, but anyway,
Oh goodness.
so any other stories with brown ales? Any other good encounters, bad encounters? What do we want the brewery? So I'm going to say breweries out there, brown ale with a bit of coffee. Maybe also an option without the coffee.
Yeah, no
With
coffee.
nuts, without nuts, so we can do our tasting
Yes.
comparisons. What
Yeah,
else?
I think always just, shout out to both Lochgill and Ballykilcavan for keeping one on, in the core range, because, oh my God, thank goodness you guys, they are so good, and just, happy to have that as a go-to, but yeah, would be happy to have more. So,
Mm.
putting it out into the universe.
Agreed. It would just be nice to see different styles and not always a million varieties of like New England IPAs. Like we could have at least one brown ale, at least one malt forward non-brown ale beer in a standard lineup, and it would be really interesting. And I like the idea of having a bit of a lager ale comparison, if possible.
Oh,
But that's just because I like both.
Wide Street has an beer out at the moment. So for those in Ireland,
Yes.
just note, well worth checking out.
Erica actually drank that on one of our recent podcasts, and she raves about it. So go
Very
pick it up.
good.
Okay, go White Street.
Mm.
I was going to say something else, wasn't I? Oh, so dark mild. Are we considering dark mild a brown ale?
This is a tricky one because I love dark milds. I will say no.
Okay.
And again, a lot of this just based on, I'm going to Martin Cornell's article and saying, well, he says no. So
Okay.
he's probably right. And I the other reason I say no is because then I feel like more people will make more different things. So the Four Provinces Dark Mild is a gorgeous beer. Again, anyone in Ireland, go check it out. It is absolutely wonderful. I feel like the difference now is they do tend to be lower ABV than your maybe sort of standard brown ale, but it's still dark and lovely, tons of flavor. Highly recommend, but I think we'll count them as different.
Okay.
Mm.
Okay.
Different, but within the same umbrella.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
On the periphery of the Venn diagram somewhere.
Exactly.
Somewhere there. Certainly on the lower ABV side, right? So, and slightly different brewing ingredients, but much of the same.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And I'm thinking on that, we've covered everything there is to cover so far on brown ales, but we will ask people, what are your favorite brown ales?
Absolutely.
Why are there not more brown ales in Ireland or in the US? Do you have them in the UK? I think the UK have far more than we have here. Lisa, you've lived there. Would you agree, or have they fallen out of favor, or are they coming back?
That's a good question, but I lived there in the 90s, so there was just Newcastle Brown then. But again, there's the one from the Colonel, which is beautiful, so maybe more are coming back.
Okay. So on that note, I'm gonna tell you all to follow us on Twitter at Beer Ladies Pod and Instagram at Beer Ladies Pod. Also on Facebook, the Beer Ladies Podcast. We're on YouTube, Beer Ladies Podcast. We're on wherever you get your podcasts, be that anywhere, everywhere. So tune in, listen, subscribe, like, comment, send us any messages you want. Well, nice messages, please. only.
Yes. Yes. We will delete if you're gross. Don't do that. Yeah.
We just don't engage. Okay, so on that note, I'm going to say good evening, good night,
Thank you.
and happy
Bye.
Friday.